Hi, this is Paul. As I mentioned on this morning's homeroom video, I thought it was an outstanding conversation with Esther Meek. And I found that conversation to really, what I liked about the conversation is that we've been talking about this in the corner for a long time. It was provoked by Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, Jonathan Peugeot, and to have Esther Meek come at this conversation in a very different vein. She doesn't in any way come out of the Jordan Peterson sphere or through John Vervaeke. Now, she came to me through Vervaeke, but others had found her previously. Notably, Karen Wong had found her because Esther Meek's background is in philosophy, and as she says in the piece or in the conversation, she sort of came at this naturally. She had I didn't get a chance to get into her story as much as I would have liked to. Sometimes conversations just go that way. She is very much on a mission. She has discovered something, and as an analytic philosopher, is it analytical philosopher, or analytic philosopher? I don't know which one, but she has come to this, and she has very much come into the meaning crisis space in a way differently than John Vervaeke did, for example. And so, what's fun about her is that comes, she sort of she discovers how can I say this? Chesterton has this great story at the beginning of, is it The Everlasting Man or Orthodoxy? I don't know. The Everlasting Man, where someone goes on a sea journey and and accidentally bumps up back in England. So in some ways, both Esther Meek and John Vervaeke had a similar journey. But for Esther Meek, because of her continued commitment and practice of the Christian faith, in some ways she discovers something that feels foreign and seems foreign. And I also loved one of the big takeaways from the thing. I also loved the fact that I had a real good understanding of why she writes books. She writes books in many ways for the same reason I make videos. And even though in the conversation I really try to nudge her into video making, she sort of resists, and that's totally fine. If book writing does what she needs it for her, that's totally good. I think book writing will last a lot longer than video making, even though video making potentially goes out over time. I think a lot about this question of what impacts the world, and of course, books can leave a lasting legacy. Videos can sort of leave a temporary legacy. I think we have no idea what kind of tail videos are going to have because they've been with us for such a short amount of time. They might just sort of all go away. But, part of also what I was tried to press her on a little bit, I really had to be gentle with this because part of my critique is that I don't think the best way to get at this, and she basically acknowledged this when she talked about her workshops, and she's definitely someone that if I start hosting conferences, she's definitely on my list about someone I want to bring out here to do her stuff because she is very much acting as an exorcist for, let's use Vervaeke's language because that's what we're most in keeping with, the propositional tyranny. But of course, Vervaeke knows Polanyi, and she sort of is a disciple of his, and so she's bringing all that to the fore. And so what I'm going to do is sort of drop a little video in here of some summaries from the conversation.
My experience has also had me kind of flying under certain sorts of radar.
Yep.
But my particular issue really was, how do we know? And so, and my particular shtick, I think, is helping everybody uh, to see how knowing actually works I think that my belief is that the proposals about knowing that I've been blessed to garner will make you better at whatever your job is. And oh, by the way, it'll also make you better at knowing God. So, I've developed ideas about how I think knowing works, and I feel, I'm not particularly politically involved, inclined, that sort of thing. But I do think that one of the issues with the evangelical tradition to this day, in some form or other, is epistemology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I'm sure Leslie Newbegin's work, but,
Yep.
I feel like he threw down a gauntlet that I picked up, which is, you got to do some sort of pre-evangelistic epistemology, because our presume we've got these implicit skewed presumptions that we kind of imbibed from modernity, that's gumming up the works of all corners of our life. And before we can even talk about like faith and art or whatever, we've got to fix knowing. So I feel about myself, I'll never run out of a job. Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah. I have to say, I was in this for myself.
Good.
And I needed the answers to my questions. And what I've come up with is not, I've taught history of philosophy. I I've got philosophical information, but that's not my gift to give other people. And it's not that I'm a philosopher. Oh, I am a philosopher, and I went at this philosophically, but uh, I have, like I said in the intro, I've kind of left the ivory tower
Yeah.
because I'm interested in the streets, like the
Yeah.
rock musicians,
Yeah.
and so actually, back to Jesus. Well, first of all, to the left brain, right brain thing, and even Pascal, the genius of Polanyi is that he says, look, where the math belongs is at the subsidiary. So he talks about destructive analysis, which would be a reverting to fixate on what you ought to be subsidiarily indwelling. Like on a bike, if you were revert to fixate on your foot on the pedal,
Right.
well, you see, that's the end of the performance,
Right.
right?
Well, I my favorite example of that are free throw shooters in basketball.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
way to make a free throw shooter miss is get them thinking.
Right. Exactly. But it's not it's more the from to,
Yes.
and that really actually frees the finesse. So the problem, I say the problem with modernity is a knowledge as information mindset. That's what I
Yes.
call it in Little Manual for Knowing.
Yep.
And the problem with is not information. The problem is information as a philosophical paradigm.
Yes.
So the problem is philosophical.
Yes.
So, science experiments are great, but they're not meant to be philosophical paradigms. That's what I say. Now, back to Jesus. My feeling was, as I got on board with what Polanyi was saying, it exactly went with the Bible in a way that the what I had inherited epistemologically simply didn't go. So once you're on board with this, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus, I've been thinking repeatedly about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. His subversive act of showing up at the place where the renewal of the covenant happened by Joshua, and saying, I am the living water, sitting down, claiming that well, and then, saying to the woman, oh, you've had five husbands and the one you have is not your own. As if, look, I'm the seventh husband. That dress doesn't do you justice. You're now caught up in a larger reality. And my epistemology profoundly resonates. The one I've been blessed to grope my way toward. which the thing about Loving to Know is it's full of 5 million conversations. That's how I've structured them
Yep.
with all these different people that I have integrated.
Yep. Yep. And so again, back to my individual, what makes you you are these people. And you have integrated them. You have brought them into yourself, and that
Mhm.
makes you you. And then, but there's the you that is also scaling with, I mean, right now you and I are having this conversation. There's the people that are in your life, and so then then we continue to scale. And again, it's all of this knowing each other in the way that you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. By
Well,
the way, when I think of what I am, I often call myself an epistemological therapist.
besides the fall, why did it get so bad? What is it about the current paradigm that is so captivating to us?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm gonna, I'm very simplistic about, modernity, but the fathers of modernity were the masters, were about uh, human mastery of nature. And if you're gonna abuse an other, the first thing you do is reduce it to less than other,
Yeah.
so that then you can manipulate it and force it and control. So that's why, then if you reduce knowledge to bits of information that you're going to amass and scale and commodify, right? I mean, I think the god of modernity is utility, and that's why it's literally an anti-philosophical philosophy, which is why everybody thinks, oh, well, I'm a nuts and bolts person. I'm not philosophical. So that's why I'm not ever going to run out of a job.
No, no, I know that. You certainly will
Oh,
not run out of a job.
you know that in the Reformational tradition we talk about the noetic effects of sin,
Yeah.
and there's always going to be that. But in modernity is a noetic effect of sin, and it's ours. And so if we're going to talk about it, I mean, that's really where we in the modern West need to start, and in particular because it's killing us. It's killing us. It's killing mission. It's killing the church. It's killing business.
Well, it's
Somebody
killing
wrote,
medicine.
yeah, somebody wrote to me, years ago and say, look, little manual. Every entrepreneur needs to read this so they'll stop committing suicide.
Yeah. Now, this morning I had a conversation with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau about the advent of the sacred. When I heard John talking about that quite a bit, I thought, oh, that's really something I want to talk about because both terms are well known in Christian groups, but both terms are tricky. And I think this might be my favorite conversation with the two of them. I feel a little bad because I don't know if Jonathan necessarily got everything in he wanted to, but I think John did. And I thought the conversation went extremely well. It's also in No Wait, No Ads. Now, I know some of you, well, just release it right away. Well, I've got a little trip coming up, and so what I do is I usually hold these things a little bit until I don't have homeroom videos, and then I'll release it during the homeroom time slot. Well, what are you talking about with respect to homeroom? That's sort of this little corner language when Grim Grizz dubbed the fact that I usually release a video on weekdays at like 5 a.m. Pacific, 8 a.m. Eastern, and that sort of got coined as homeroom. And then off the day goes for the corner after that. But this was a tremendous conversation, I thought. And so if you absolutely can't wait, it's in No Wait, No Ads. It's $7. You can end your membership after you've seen it if you really can't wait. Probably less than a week, which is when the thing's going to be out. Which if I had no wait, no ads, it would just sit on my hard drive, and a whole bunch of you would write me and beg me to see an advanced copy. So that's why I did the thing. But I thought this was a tremendous conversation, and I think it's the fruit of years of. I should take a. That's a pretty good. It's a pretty good thumbnail, except I've got my eyes closed. But at one point in the video, and I sort of, you'll hear me say it in the video, I'm sort of struck by the fact that we've been talking together, the three of us, for a number of years, and building up the trust, building up the rapport, all of that is really important for getting at this. And I thought it was an excellent conversation in terms of John has this thesis he's working on, and I always feel sort of bad because Peugeot and I were both Christians, and do we kind of gang up on him? And I don't want to do that, but John can more than hold his own. So I thought it was just an outstanding conversation. There's so much good stuff and so much clarity I got out of it. But again, in a number of places, I thought John Vervaeke very powerfully made the point about parallel to what Esther Meek is doing in terms of the end of modernity. This way of approaching the world is coming to an end. I often talk about it as the recession of modernity. Peterson calls it the counter-enlightenment, and the advent of the sacred is a part of that. And so there's a big way, again, in which Esther Meek very much fits into the corner, but she came at it through a different route, and she came at it, staying the whole time very much as a Christian. And so I'm just going to drop a little clip from that conversation, my conversation with John and Jonathan, in right now.
And then what's happening, and this is part of what's going on in my book, when I came into the cognitive science of religion, I said, I'm not going to give you a definition of religion. I can't, because the very word we use and the concept we have is all within the Enlightenment framework. And the Enlightenment framework is built of all these disastrous dichotomies, right? The fact-value distinction, is ought, theory, data, right? Mind, body, mind, world, self, other, religion, science. That whole fable that religion and science have been in nothing but conflict has been destroyed by excellent historical work. The relationship is much more complicated and much more one of mutual affordance and mutual transformation. And all of them, the fact, like, if you want to, I can get into it, but, where is relevance a fact or a value? Well, relevance points to that there aren't any facts without relevance, and there are no relevance that aren't correctable by the facts. All right. And the startling thing to do is just ask people, what do you mean by a fact? And they go, you all worry about value and subjective and how could it possibly be real? And you just take it that you know what a fact is. Well, Putnam destroys that. Quine destroys the analytics. And so these are not like, people on the beach in LA, right? This is the guts of rigorous analytic philosophy. And so what I said to them is, I'm going to run through, right? And the demarcation problem in science, right, which is a central problem. There's no clean way of deciding where science leaves off and non-science begins. You just like all of this. And I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do like Wittgenstein does. I'm going to take apart, I'm going to deconstruct and dissolve a picture. And then how does reality and religio now disclose itself to you? And what might you be called to say about religion from that? That's what I'm doing. And that is the advent of the sacred.
Now, I set all of that up to set up my conversation on this video. I don't think Aaron Renn is sufficiently appreciated for what he's doing. Aaron, I find, in my opinion, so often has his finger on the political, cultural pulse, but in a way that isn't just sort of a shallow culture warrior. And I see that with the kinds of guests he brings on and the kinds of ways that he challenges them. And so he brought James Davison Hunter, who was the guy who, in the English language world, actually brought to us the term culture war. And Hunter has written some very important and very influential books in the past. And he has now come out with another one that I think is going to be just as timely, just as influential, and just as important. Now, for For those of you who are fans of Clara and her study project, which is this little corner, James Davison Hunter is a sociologist. He is not a theologian. He is not a politician. He is not a political scientist. He's a sociologist, and he's been tracking very carefully a number of the things going on. And I think probably today is the day after the election. Here we are, and I know I'm not going to say anything about it now because I think, at least on one side of the aisle, emotions are too raw. I mean, I am hearing from some people, and they are. I mean, it's 2016 all over again. I'll be a little bit of a troll. I just could not forget Aaron Sorkin's letter that he wrote to his daughter in 2016 after Donald Trump was elected. And he basically says, well, this is one last stumble in the end of history, and we won't let this happen again. And well, here we are again. History is a very strange thing. And so often we imagine, oh, we know what's coming. We never do. Well, let me let Aaron give a little bit of introduction to James Davison Hunter so you can have a sense of how important this guy is.
Hello, it's Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the show. Today I have very special guest, James Davison Hunter. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. He's also the author of many influential books. This includes Culture Wars. In fact, I believe he coined the term culture war in an English language context, Before the Shooting Begins and to Change the World. And we're here today to talk about his latest book, Democracy and Solidarity, on the cultural roots of America's political crisis. And this is an important book. I want to tell you that. It's not a light read, but I think it's an important read for anyone who wants to understand our cultural moment. So, Dr. Hunter, thank you for joining us.
You're quite welcome. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Two things I want to say in advance that really struck me about why I thought the book was impressive. I started reading it, and I immediately see that you're going to tell a story of American history, so I put on my skeptic's hat, and I start making a mental list of all the things that I think are important and pivotal in American history that a lot of people don't talk about. And I'm like, oh, he's going to talk about this, he's going to talk about that. By the end of the book, you talked about all of them. And that even includes things like early 20th century anarchist violence.
Yeah.
The second thing was, I thought it was remarkably even-handed. I'm sure everybody who reads it's going to complain about something, but it was very obvious that you tried very hard to be fair and nonpartisan. And I'm sure you're not a Claremont Institute guy, but I bet if the Claremont Institute people read your description of them, they may not agree with everything, but they say that was a fair portrayal.
I want to read a little bit from the book. It is an audiobook and it is on Kindle, so it is available. Chapter 1, the cultural crisis of liberal democracy. The crisis of democracy in America is apparent to all. Now, actually, I thought one of the things about the election was that American democracy is a little bit more durable than both sides seem to let on. Everyone was ready for Trump to lose and then complain that it was rigged, which I think he probably would have done, but he won. And so I think one of the things that the election gave was a fair amount of confidence that actually the state secretaries of state are competent and do a good job. And I'm impressed by the fact that the federal government does not run elections. The states run elections. And I think it's, on the whole, quite a good system. It sort of distributes. And that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen in different places. Just read about John F. Kennedy's election and some of the stuff that happened in Texas. So there's always some foolishness going on, and both sides are really heated to try to rig it one way or another. But for the most part, I think what held were our system of elections, and that's a good thing. I also saw this morning that Rod Dreher had a post where he notes that, I can pull it over into this page. He notes that many months ago, I drank beer with my friend in Munich and asked if he thought that there was any chance Trump would ask him to be his running mate. Nah, man, I don't think that at all. Now he's going to be the next vice president of the United States. God is good, and so is J.D. Vance. And, I like many, I was moved by the book. And of course, he's not a senator from the state of California, and I haven't paid any attention to him as an elected official. He went from never Trumper to VP, yada, yada. All that stuff is out there. And, well, he's going to be president of the United States. And the thing that strikes me is that this kid, it's an amazing story, however you feel about his politics, that here in America still, whether it's Kamala Harris, who grew up from humble origins, or J.D. Vance, who grew up from humble origins, that these people who grew up from humble origins, in fact, can, in a relatively short life, shorter than mine, rise to the heights of power in America. It's a truly amazing thing, and something I think the nation should feel good about. But of course, merely elections are not what democracy is. There's a lot more to it than that. Ordinary Americans of all backgrounds and convictions recognize that the entire political ecosystem, not only in its leadership and in its governing institutions, but also in its leading ideas and ideals, is failing. This predicament is made worse by the fact that Americans themselves are increasingly fragmented and polarized, unable to even converse across their differences, much less find a way to work together in solidarity to address what is a common crisis. And I always find this point to be a little bit overblown. I think part of the reality is now with the internet, we hear so many more voices, and so we assume so much fragmentation, but we still seem to continue to be a two-party system, and quite frankly, the identity and positions of those two parties have changed dramatically even in the last 20, 30 years. Someone made a comment that Kamala Harris was probably the most conservative Democrat that they had seen. I think it was McMo in the TLC election coverage on CBAX's channel. And Donald Trump is hardly a traditional conservative. I mean, at all. And this election, he totally backtracks on abortion and a number of other social issues, many of which seem to be only politically or motivationally held the first time around. Yet he did bring conservative justices to the court, et cetera, whatever. So I wonder about most fragmented. The question that follows are urgent as they are obvious. Just how deep is the problems facing the American democracy, and how can it be fixed? If we take politicians, political activists, journalists, and the most impassioned citizens as our guide, we will tend to see the problems we face in contemporary political life as rooted in the corruption, bad decisions, or flawed ideology of a particular leader or party. Now, what I'm about to say will probably on many days, especially in the heat of an election, have both sides accusing me of both sidesism, but I tend to think Hunter is right here. So the day after, everybody's either rejoicing or wounded, so I can probably get away with it today. It's the Democrats' fault. No, it's the Republicans' fault. Partisans of all stripes see things this way. The leaders and the parties of the opposition are nearly always portrayed as being beyond the pale, a threat to decency, civility, justice, and fairness. Indeed, a threat to America, and this year they spent billions. And again, I managed to avoid almost all political television advertising until I visited my mother, who was just watching local news, and yeah, it was going on at the federal level, but there was a governor race in New Hampshire that was just brutal. The negative ads, and these were two women running, all the time. It's, well, if women ran the world, they would be yada yada, and it's like the campaigns run by these two women were about as brutal and libelous as I've ever seen any in the great state of New Hampshire. So there you have that. The news media reinforce this polarization when they report, often with manifest prejudice, on the ups and downs of political fortune by this candidate or that, this party or that, this issue or that. For most activists, commentators, and citizens, the crisis of democracy is not a common crisis. It is one caused by the other side. The question of how to restore, and I'll make a prediction now. 2028 election, when Trump constitutionally is not permitted to run, even though I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised to have him making noises, come January that he's going to try and get this constitutional amendment overturned. I wouldn't bet on it. It's really hard to amend the Constitution of the United States. And plus the fact he'll be 4 years older by then. So I'm not holding my breath. Will it be J.D. Vance? He'll then be the vice president running for president, perhaps. Will the Republicans primary him? We'll have to see. Now, at least the Democrats will be forced to hold a primary. Won't that be a novel thing? Look forward to seeing that. The news media reinforce this polarization. Okay. For most activists, the question of how to restore democracy then comes down to mobilizing our political will in a new election or a new referendum, voting the wrong party out and the right party in. It's as simple as that. More astute observers of American political life today recognize that the problems are deeper than any particular politician or any particular election cycle. But even their accounts tend to locate the concern about democracy within politics itself. For example, in the weakening of Americans' voting system through voter suppression or bureaucratic challenges to the independence of state elections, procedures, and personnel. And I suspect, I'm sure there'll be a ton of court cases and looking into it. I mean, we've never had more peering eyes into things than we've had in some ways with the internet. So, but again, I think part of the big wins last night was actually the electoral system. I'm not saying it's perfect, but the guy who was going to complain fraud won, so at least we won't have to hear that. And maybe some people will look back at the 2020 election and say, well, maybe that one was okay too. Still others highlight the fragmentation and polarization within the electorate and among political parties. For instance, the increase in vulgarity, incivility, and extremism in political discourse, as well as the abuse of basic ethics of governing. Some cite the excess power of the state, while others lament its declining power and effectiveness. The more compelling of these accounts go further, relating to the political problems to a broader social pathologies, including a growing individualism and the loss of social capital. The bonding and bridging relationships in politics and private life that foster trust and cooperation. Such accounts make note of the increasing us versus them, fractionalizing of the identity politics, the polarizing effect of social media in the political process, and the growing economic inequality dividing the interest of the privileged from those of the poor. And all are unanimous that civic life is being coarsened through the commercialization of absolutely everything. Remarkably, despite the difficult realities surrounding our troubled democracy, we still tend to conclude that whatever the problems we face, they are, in the end, fixable. The ideas proposed are nearly always constructive, even if not entirely practicable. By these accounts, we can address the deeply fractured and dysfunctional nature of a republic by reviving the mediating institutions of family, community, churches, schools, charities, local associations, and local markets. We can renew the depleted social capital that withers the bonds of our community and endangers the effectiveness of schools, the safety of neighborhoods, equity and taxation, day-to-day honesty and trust, and even our health and happiness through education, work-based initiatives, and community service programs. We can address the alienation of the electorate from the government, of the rich from the poor, and of minorities from majorities through new or renewed government programs and reforms. We can overcome our debased and fractionalized public discourse by examining our own blind spots, or by rejecting the dehumanization of our political opponents and recognizing that the purpose of the political discourse isn't to score partisan points or even to be proven right, but rather to better ascertain truth and reality. And right there is where the recession of modernity sort of takes hold, because this is, someone asked me the other day, was it David Wilson that that kept talking about sense making. I don't know who coined that term, but it is a good term because really what we're talking about is sense making. And I, for one, am, on one hand, it's easy to get really excited about the recession of modernity by looking for a better epistemology, as Esther Meek is, by maybe I'll play a little bit of the end of my conversation with Peugeot and Vervaeke. In our post-Protestant age, we sort of hear progress. And then we get to sacred, and it's going to be rebalancing us. Because remember, this world always has both ends of the sacred, and we go back and forth. So when you say a new world is being born right now, I don't know the valence in which to hear it.
Well, what I mean by that is like the world that we thought was the world, the domesticated world of all the disastrous dichotomies, is falling away. Like the scales falling away from Paul's eyes.
Okay, there's the recession of modernity or the counter-enlightenment, what have you.
And there's a new way of seeing. And in that new way of seeing, there's a new way of being in which transcendence, I call it strong transcendence, not just psychological improvement, but it has epistemological and ontological depth to it, is now scientifically plausible. Think about that. Think about the possibility of that we can talk deeply about this in a way that reaches to the depths of what people are often hungering for in religion without buying into the dichotomy between religion and science. That is possible. Now, I'm not arguing for scientism. Scientism is part of the Enlightenment picture I'm rejecting.
Yep,
I'm arguing for what you see in, and I think hopefully we're exapting Maximus or Dionysius or Thomas Aquinas, which is no, you better not keep these two apart because that's disastrous. That's disastrous. And so I'm trying to play in the Christian ballpark, right? There has been this continual recognition in the Christian traditions that if you keep these things separated from each other, that is a hole through which evil walks, and you have to keep them bound. This is what I'm talking about. This is the register, that there is a world in which the scales on our eyes of all the dichotomies, right, that straitjacket us, is falling away, and in which strong transcendence is possible. And so that there is a way individually and collectively, and even at the level of a civilization, we can participate in a response to the Enlightenment. We can wake up. We can grow up. I'm sorry, I find that deeply personally motivating, and I know a lot of people do. So I don't know if I'm addressing your question, but that's what it. And I keep using the biblical language because I'm trying to, and I don't think that language is utopic. When the scales fall away from Paul's eyes, he doesn't propose, he doesn't say let's build Jerusalem on the hill like Blake, which is a little bit worrying. It's a great poem, Jerusalem, but it's a little bit until we've built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. I don't know if you should be doing that. That's probably not a good idea, right? Right. Although a lot
of people love that song.
I love that. That poem is one of my favorite. And and the thing is, if you give yourself over to the poem, you feel the triumph. But that triumph is dangerous, and that we've been talking about that.
When I was in one of my fond memories of my visit to Oxford with my wonderful hosts was I went, they went to church on Sunday. I was there over Sunday and said, yes, I want to go to your church. That's definitely, I mean, I want to go to a local Anglican church with an Anglican family, and I want to do the whole thing. And we, in fact, sang that song, and my host just said, he was so happy when he saw it he said, we get to sing this. And when, as counter-enlightenment, recession of modernity, so much is going to change in this, and none of us have any idea of just how consequential these changes are going to be. And Hunter addresses this in that video
of this culture war issue, and what happens if there are no democratic options. It came to, at least at a occurred to me that the pro-life side would actually turn to violence. So I've done that, and then through the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, I've also done some empirical studies, national surveys. But look, this is the broader context here is, and to really get to the heart of your question is this. Social science, the social sciences generally are both ideologically committed and I would say dispositionally oriented to the center left and the left. And
again, this is a point that Peterson's been making. It's not just true of psychology, it's true of sociology. And the social sciences, of course, are birthed in the Enlightenment.
And those commitments and those dispositions orient one toward a certain understanding of the world. And for most of the 20th century, how the left and right understood each other, how the conflict, most political conflict was understood, was along the lines of political economy. It was the division between corporate interests and the interests of labor unions, between the working class and the business class. Something was happening in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that struck me as fundamentally different. It was not only that conflict was taking shape around certain kinds of cultural issues, but that how the left was understanding itself, how the right was understanding itself, was also undergoing a profound shift. And I think now in retrospect, we see it as an identitarian shift, away from issues of political economy and toward these cultural issues, filtered through mainly through issues of identity. So I was trying to not only understand the nature of these conflicts and how they were woven together, but I was also trying to make a statement within mainstream social science that my colleagues within the social sciences weren't taking culture seriously. They were still wed to certain kinds of analytical understandings that were rooted in political, again, commitments and dispositions that just weren't playing out anymore. And, you know, the day I got tenure was the day I...
And it's part of the reason I mentioned the Alan Sorkin thing is because part of the latter part of the conversation with Peugeot and Vervaeke, I really start to press John on questions of eschatology, because I would say that the eschatological facet is always a part of any cultural liturgy, and your even implicit commitments to particular worldviews are going to impact your eschatology.
I quit the American Sociological Association mainly because I didn't think one could do innovative work in the social sciences.
And this again makes me think of, you know, how many people are having difficulty. Maybe there's their College of Psychology or some of the institutions that are most important are these professional institutions. So clergy are part of that. So it's a denomination, it's a confessionality that we're part of. Psychologists and their credentialing or their certificates, or, I mean, we have in liberal society, we've created all of these institutions to govern these particular sciences, and they are beholden. Again, and these are all in many ways copies of church institutions, all copies of confessionality, but they're instead in these scientific things. And I thought it was amazing that He quit his. Now he's of a stature and a standing where he can. Often, at least in the clergy world, it happens with retirement. Once you reach emeritus status, well, then suddenly you can sort of break from the institution and say what you really think.
Within the framework of the profession. And because tenure dispositions that just weren't playing out anymore. And, the day I got tenure was the day I quit the American Sociological Association, mainly because I didn't think one could do innovative work in the social sciences within the framework of the profession. So it's not that I gave up my commitment to the profession, to the discipline. I'm still a very committed sociologist. I just didn't think one could do it with any kind of creativity from that framework. So I was both trying to make an important contribution to understanding the nature of the moment, but I was also trying to make a statement within mainstream social science about the heart of culture. And at the heart of culture, of course, is religion. It's undeniable. So there are all sorts of methodological and conceptual things I was trying to do. And that has been a theme. I'm not letting you get a word in edgewise. I'll stop in just a second. But that's been a theme for me throughout the course of my career. And it continues to be a theme in this book, as you know. So.
Well, this was a deeply pessimistic book. You used terms like late stage democracy. In fact, I believe that was the title of one of the sections of your book.
Yeah.
And as I'm reading it, I think to myself, America's gone through tremendous periods of turmoil before, arguably worse than this. The Civil War was obviously a terrible moment in the country. Maybe the 1960s, the upheavals of the 1960s. We've always managed to come through them and have these sort of reconsolidation phases. What's different about today's environment?
Well, there's a lot different. First of all, yes, you're absolutely right. The country has been through, in many respects, much worse than it's going through right now. But in certain respects, but a couple things are worth remembering. The Civil War, the bloodiest war in America's history, an absolute promiscuously bloody catastrophe.
Now, again, when you watch, I'm going to also post a clip. By the time you watch this, I will have posted it. I posted sort of the opening statement by John Vervaeke on the advent of the sacred. But then Jonathan Peugeot gave a really nice segment on sacrifice and sacred and sacrality and its inevitability. And just as in many ways the Holocaust and Hiroshima become the sacred touchstones for the post-World War II era, the Civil War becomes a sacred touchstone for American civilization.
Was preceded by a 30-year culture war. And as I argue in this book and in other places, culture wars always precede shooting wars. They don't necessarily end in a shooting war. But you never have a shooting war without a culture war prior to it, because culture, of course, provides the justifications for violence. And this culture war has been going on for at least 40 years, and it has not only evolved, but it has deepened. In fact, the very first presentation I made after the publication of Culture Wars in 1992, a colleague got up and said, "What culture wars? It's a mopping up campaign." No one is saying that now. So
now, and it's also helpful to understand, let's say, the culture war, which was the Protestant Reformation, then leads to the Reformational Wars, and you can begin to understand, especially in a Christian milieu that has within it strong biases against violence And again, in the Peugeot Vervaeke conversation, Jonathan nicely lays out that understanding of sacrality and violence and the cross, and in a Girardian way tries to, part of the reason Christianity, I think, as opposed to, let's say, Islamism, as we've seen in the last 40, 50 years, people keep pointing to the Protestant Reformation as having taught Christianity something about the limits of violence. And this has gone on because of the ongoing reflection of the cross and what the cross means. It doesn't mean that violence is completely banished, but it's understandable why people just imagine civil war in America again. Yet Americans have a lot to lose. And wars are very tricky things when they come up. And then again, someone might argue that the war between Russia and Ukraine is a form of a civil war, even though they are two different nation states that obviously were under one in the Soviet era. So
there's inherent danger in any culture war, precisely because it does provide the preconditions for violent confrontation. But there's another important difference. As I look around the world at conflicts around the world, and especially at conflicts that end in ethnic cleansing, what is always at stake is how we define the other, our opposition, our enemy. And when conflicts, cultural conflicts, are oriented, define the opposition as less than human, as not full citizens and worthy of the privileges and protections of the community, those conflicts very often end in terrible bloodshed. And that's certainly what happened. That was the heart of the Civil War. Whatever else was going on, sectional differences and the like, it was fundamentally a battle over the nature of Black humanity. And these kinds of sort of larger cosmological issues are at play in what I call the deep structures of this cultural conflict. It goes to the very heart of what the contemporary culture war is about. Not only sort of the nature of humanity, of sort of anthropology or philosophical anthropology and theological anthropology, but also it goes to the heart of the nature of reality, of how we know reality, our common ethics, or lack thereof. So those kinds of things are new, and we see this in I mean, certainly in the world that I inhabit and public opinion surveys. There is no solidarity
no, and I think
that binds us across and in spite of the cultural cleavages that define our moment today.
and then he's going to ask him about solidarity. So I'll put the link to the whole video below. It's 49 minutes. It's not a tremendously long video, but you can sense there the, what is at stake? Why? Peterson often talks about, if you want to, you get a better handle on truth if you can see something from multiple disciplines. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing. It's at work in the political. We're undergoing a massive cultural change. And I think it is on the level of the Protestant Reformation. It's, again, another one of these 500-year changes where we're going to see the world in very different ways. Well, that's probably a good place to stop here. Again, leave a comment. Let me know what you think.
Well, I don't know about about the meaning crisis, left, right, black, white, or other vices, which Jesus Christ is right, or if we're all saved. From my perspective, our propositions participate procedurally, running in circles. We're in body, we're in the age of decay. Symbolically speaking, the reapers are reaping, them damn egregores are whispering sweetly. We're all NPCs in the belly of the beast. Red pill, blue pill, bread pill, Mars Hill, or DMT, or whatever you feel. Got one and number two, it's all the same damn thing. So clean your room, repent on Zoom, ontology for dummies, a bird's eye view. 'Cause if you really knew, could you really even say? Totally depraved, all totally saved, a total disposition from the bed we all made. Or is it the elect, or are we just insane? From John Vervaeke to Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson to the Chris Pacou Show, Paul Vanderklays and Griswold Grimm and all the dice he shakes. This estuary ditty is a little bit cringy, ain't quite the U-shaped or the hero's journey. All the NPCs in the flood treading water to watch you save the day with a bunch of chitter-chatter. From the ortho bros to the Catholic Joes, or atheistic Jobs, to Protestant folks, the Joe Schmoes and Jewish Jacobs, and everything in between. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own.